In St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, along a dirt road that no longer appears on modern maps, a small wooden schoolhouse once stood beside the bayou. Children gathered there each morning, their names carefully written into a leather-bound attendance ledger. The ink was neat, the dates were precise. And then, without warning, the entries stopped. Not at the end of the term, not after summer break. In the middle of March, the roll call simply ends. No closure notice, no explanation, just unfinished pages and missing families. A school existed here. The records prove it. So why do they suddenly go silent? Bayou Ridge School was never meant to be mysterious. It was one of dozens of small parish-funded schools serving rural families across southern Louisiana in the early 20th century. Built to educate the children of farmers, laborers, and tradesmen, it followed a routine that rarely made headlines. Attendance was logged daily. Funding was allocated through parish meetings. Teachers were assigned by district supervisors. Everything about it suggests an ordinary institution doing ordinary work. But when local archivists began digitizing early education records decades later, they noticed something that didn't fit that pattern. The school's ledger did not conclude with a final exam or graduation list. It ended abruptly in mid-March. No formal closure appears in board minutes. No transfer documents explain where the students went. The administrative trail simply breaks. And when history stops recording something, the silence itself becomes part of the story. Bayou Ridge was not a town in the formal sense. It was a loose cluster of homes stretched along a bend in the bayou several miles outside Okaloosa, where cypress knees rose from dark water and the ground stayed soft long after heavy rain. The road leading there was packed dirt, shaped more by wagon wheels than by engineering. In the early decades of the 20th century, this part of St. Landry Parish was agricultural country. Sugarcane fields, small vegetable plots, and scattered livestock enclosures bordered by hand-built fences. The school stood on slightly raised ground, intentionally positioned above seasonal flood levels. Parish property maps mark it as a modest rectangular structure, measuring roughly 24 by 30 feet. It was a one-room wooden building with tall windows designed to invite cross breezes in the humid Louisiana heat. The paint, originally white, weathered quickly under the sun and rain. A narrow porch ran along the front, where children sometimes left muddy boots before stepping inside. Inside, the room was simple but orderly. Rows of wooden desks faced a slate chalkboard mounted on the eastern wall. A cast-iron stove sat near the center, used during colder months when damp winter air crept through the boards. Hooks along the back wall held coats and lunch pails. The teacher's desk stood slightly elevated on a platform, a small architectural reminder of authority in a community that valued structure and discipline. Bayou Ridge School was not isolated in mission, even if it was remote in geography. It was part of a broader effort across Louisiana to expand rural education after the turn of the century. Parish boards sought to improve literacy rates and formalize instruction beyond basic home tutoring. Schools like Bayou Ridge represented progress, small but meaningful investments in community development. Most students came from farming families whose livelihoods depended on the land and the seasons. During planting and harvest months, attendance often fluctuated. Parish records from neighboring districts show similar patterns. Children absent for days to assist with crops, then returning once labor demands eased. This rhythm was expected and documented. It was part of rural life. Despite its size, the school functioned as more than an academic space. It served as a community gathering point. Seasonal events, small recitals, holiday programs, spelling competitions brought families together. In rural parishes, the schoolhouse often doubled as a civic hub. Notices were sometimes posted on its door. Community discussions occasionally took place on its porch. There was nothing about Bayou Ridge that suggested instability. Tax rolls show consistent funding allocations for teacher salary and minor maintenance. Parish meeting summaries from surrounding years indicate no structural damage, no emergency repairs, no recorded disputes. In fact, the school appears entirely ordinary within the broader administrative landscape. And perhaps that is what makes its later silence so striking. Because when institutions fail suddenly, there are usually traces, insurance claims, repair orders, replacement contracts. Fires leave debris reports, floods leave damage assessments. Even declining enrollment produces paperwork. But Bayou Ridge's physical footprint slowly faded without documentation. By mid-century, maps stopped labeling the structure altogether. Later aerial surveys show only faint discoloration in the soil where the foundation once stood. The land was eventually absorbed back into private property. Crops grew where desks once stood. The road shifted slightly east over time, and modern satellite imagery barely captures the outline of what used to be there. Yet in parish archives, the school clearly existed. Its teacher was appointed. Its students were registered. Its funding was approved. Bayou Ridge was real, which makes its absence of its ending all the more difficult to explain. The building may be gone, reclaimed by humidity and soil, but places do not vanish from records without reason. They fade gradually, unless something interrupts the narrative. If buildings tell one kind of story, records tell another. And in the case of Bayou Ridge School, the paper trail is where the unease begins. The attendance ledger for the 1919-1920 academic term is preserved in the St. Landry Parish Archive, bound in cracked brown leather, its spine worn thin from use. The pages are ruled with careful columns: date, student name, presence, absence, remarks. The handwriting is steady, likely written by the same instructor throughout the term. Ink density suggests routine entries, no haste, no visible distress. From September through February, the record is consistent. Enrollment holds at 23 students. Minor absences appear, often clustered around harvest weeks or heavy rainfall. A few students miss consecutive days but return shortly after. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Then March arrives. The first week shows subtle change. 3 students marked absent for multiple days. By the second week, attendance drops to 16. No explanation is written in the remarks column, no notation of illness, no reference to weather closure. By March 14th, only 9 students are present. On March 17th, 5 names are marked present. After that date, the entries stop. There are no crossed-out pages, no ink blotches suggesting emotional interruption. The pen simply never returns to the paper. Several blank sheets remain in the ledger, enough to complete the term through May, but they remain untouched. Under normal administrative procedure, even if a school closed mid-term, the teacher was expected to. Records can tell us when something stopped. Families tell us what that stopping meant. Among the names repeated most consistently in the Bayou Ridge attendance ledger is Samuel Guidry, age 10. His name appears in near-perfect attendance from September through early March. His handwriting exercises are referenced twice in the remarks column, once for improvement in arithmetic, once for good conduct. The Guidry family appears in the 1910 federal census, living in Ward 6 of St. Landry Parish. The household included Samuel's father, Armand Guidry, listed as a farm laborer, his mother, Celeste, and 2 younger siblings. Armand could not read or write. Celeste could. That detail stands out in the census column, a single check mark in the literacy box beside her name. By 1919, tax rolls show the family renting a small parcel of land less than a mile from Bayou Ridge School. Renters did not leave the same paper trail as landowners, but their presence was documented through agricultural output listings and poll tax records. Then, in 1920, the Guidry household disappears from parish census enumeration. Absence from a census is not automatically suspicious. Census records were sometimes incomplete. Enumerators missed remote households. Families moved seasonally for work. Especially in Louisiana, migration along river corridors was common as industrial labor opportunities expanded in Baton Rouge and New Orleans. But researchers attempting to trace the Guidry family encounter something unusual. They do not appear in neighboring parishes. They do not appear in Mississippi River shipping manifests under that surname within the next 2 years. They do not appear in state death records for St. Landry Parish during that period. They simply cease to appear in local documentation at the same time Samuel's name stops appearing in the ledger. And they are not alone. 2 other families, the Landrys and the Broussards, show similar patterns. Their children's names fade from the ledger in the same 2-week window. Parish tax rolls from the following year show no updated listings under their names. Land transfers are not recorded, but both families were renters, making their movement harder to track. What complicates the story further is timing. The 1920 federal census for Louisiana was officially recorded in January of that year, 2 months before the school ledger ends. Yet census enumeration in rural areas often lagged. Some communities were counted weeks later. It is possible the families were still physically present during enumeration, but relocated shortly after. Still, when historians search shipping logs, employment records, and parish marriage registries for follow-up traces, there is no clear relocation path. This absence could have many explanations. Agricultural collapse sometimes forced quiet relocation. Health crises, particularly influenza waves lingering after 1918, disrupted communities for years. Economic downturns pushed families westward into Texas or north toward Arkansas without formal documentation. But there is another detail. In the final 2 weeks of the ledger, Samuel Guidry is marked present on March 14th. On March 15th, absent. On March 16th, absent. On March 17th, present again. It is his final recorded day. After that, no entry. Not even an absence mark. Normally, when a student permanently withdrew, teachers wrote brief notes such as moved or transferred. Those annotations appear earlier in the ledger for one student who relocated in October. But besides Samuel's name, there is nothing. No remark. No line drawn through his row. No formal withdrawal. Just blank continuation. When archivists examined the original document, they noted no torn pages in that section. The sequence of dates is intact. The cessation is deliberate, not the result of damage. Which raises a difficult question. If the school ended abruptly, did the families leave because of it, or did their departure cause the school to end? Local oral interviews collected decades later provide fragments but no clarity. One elderly resident recalled hearing that several families left quickly one spring. Another mentioned trouble but could not specify what kind. Memory softens across generations. Stories lose edges. Details blur. But patterns remain. 3 families connected to the same small rural school vanish from parish documentation within the same narrow window of time. Individually, such disappearances might be unremarkable. Collectively, they create weight. It is important not to leap to conclusions. There is no documented violence, no coroner's report, no parish inquiry, no criminal indictment tied to Bayou Ridge. Yet historians often look not only at what is recorded, but at what is missing in clusters. A missing person can be coincidence. Multiple missing records within the same time frame suggest disruption. The Guidries may have chosen to leave for opportunity. The Landrys may have relocated for seasonal work. The Broussards may have joined relatives elsewhere. All of these are plausible. But none of those possibilities explain why the administrative record does not reflect their withdrawal. Schools were structured institutions. Even in rural parishes, paperwork mattered. Funding allocations depended on enrollment counts. Sudden drops affected budgets. Boards required reporting. If 3 families withdrew simultaneously, documentation should exist. Instead, the ledger stops. And so do the families. In historical research, silence is rarely empty. It often signals transition, concealment, or loss. For Samuel Guidry and the others, March 2020 becomes a dividing line between recorded presence and archival disappearance. The land remained. The bayou flowed. But on paper, the families fade at the same moment the school does. And sometimes, when multiple stories end together, they are connected, even if the connection has long since been obscured. When records end, historians look for echoes, not dramatic revelations, not sudden confessions, but ripples, small administrative movements that indicate something shifted beneath the surface. In the case of Bayou Ridge School, the most striking feature is not what was written, it is what was not. Parish education boards in early 20th century Louisiana were methodical, if not always precise. Meeting summaries were handwritten and stored in bound volumes. Teacher appointments were recorded annually. School closures, even temporary ones, typically generated at least brief notation, especially when funding was involved. Yet in the months following March 20, Bayou Ridge does not appear in board summaries at all. No motion to suspend instruction, no budget reallocation, no transfer of students to neighboring schools. The absence is not confined to a single document, it stretches across categories. Newspaper archives from Opelousas during April and May of 1920 contain routine local reporting, crop forecasts, church gatherings, railroad updates, civic announcements. Small-town newspapers often covered even minor institutional changes, particularly those affecting children. But there is no mention of Bayou Ridge closing. Silence across multiple record types is unusual. That does not automatically imply concealment. Administrative oversight, especially in rural parishes, was common. Documents were sometimes misplaced. Clerks changed. Storage conditions deteriorated paper. But when historians assess archival gaps, they examine pattern consistency. Is the absence isolated to one ledger, or does it extend outward? At Bayou Ridge, it extends outward. Property records show no sale of the school structure in 1920 or 1921. Teacher salary disbursement logs do not list a final payout marked termination or reassignment. The teacher's name, present consistently through March, does not reappear in parish employment records the following year. It is as if the institution dissolved without formal procedure. Rural schools sometimes close due to illness outbreaks. Louisiana experienced lingering public health challenges in the years following the 1918 influenza pandemic. When illness spread, temporary closures were ordered, but even those closures were typically noted, often accompanied by brief references in newspapers warning families. There is no documented public health notice tied to Bayou Ridge. Could economic strain have forced closure? The post-World War I period brought agricultural instability. Sugarcane prices fluctuated, small farming communities felt financial pressure. Funding for rural schools sometimes declined. Yet budget cuts were discussed in parish meetings. They left traces in financial summaries. No such discussion appears in archived minutes for early 1920. Another possibility is consolidation, the merging of smaller rural schools into larger centralized ones. This process was underway across Louisiana during that era. Consolidation required transportation planning, property disposition, and student reassignment lists. Again, none appear connected to Bayou Ridge. The silence begins to feel less like neglect and more like compression, as though documentation was intentionally minimized. Intentional does not necessarily mean malicious. In small communities, reputation carried economic consequence. Scandal, whether involving misconduct, conflict, or tragedy, could damage land value, agricultural contracts, and political standing. Parish boards often prioritized stability over transparency. If something disruptive occurred, an allegation, an accident, a dispute involving prominent families, officials may have handled it informally. Records might have been abbreviated to avoid escalation. There is no direct evidence of such an event at Bayou Ridge, but the pattern of silence suggests a decision was made. A decision not to elaborate. A decision not to memorialize. In historical analysis, silence is sometimes categorized into two types: accidental and structured. Accidental silence results from loss, fire, flood, decay. Structured silence results from omission, events deemed inconvenient, embarrassing, or destabilizing. The Bayou Ridge Gap does not appear to result from physical destruction. The ledger itself survived. Surrounding parish documents survived. Other schools' records from the same year remain intact. Only Bayou Ridge fades from view. Even more telling is the language used in the later parish summary in 1922. In a brief listing of active schools, Bayou Ridge is absent, not marked closed, not marked consolidated, simply not listed. In bureaucratic language, omission can function as quiet resolution. But resolution without explanation leaves questions suspended. Communities remember disruption even when records do not. Oral histories collected decades later hinted unease. A phrase repeated in separate interviews stands out. They stopped going. Not the school closed, not it burned down. They stopped going. The phrasing centers the children, not the institution. It suggests withdrawal rather than shutdown, which raises a subtle but important distinction. Did the school end because families left, or did families leave because something happened at the school? Without documentation, causality remains uncertain. Yet silence accumulates weight. The land where Bayou Ridge stood eventually returns to agricultural use. The structure deteriorated, boards repurposed, foundations sinking into damp soil. By mid-century, maps no longer marked the building. Physical disappearance is common. Administrative disappearance is less so. When historians confront silence, they resist dramatic conclusions. They catalog what can be known. They identify patterns. They measure absence against surrounding context. And in Bayou Ridge's case, the context is clear. Other schools closed with paperwork. Other teachers were reassigned with notation. Other institutions left trails. Bayou Ridge left a void. Not loud, not violent, but deliberate enough to endure. Silence in archives is rarely empty space. It is shaped. And at Bayou Ridge, the silence feels shaped, pressed into the margins where explanation should have been.
For decades, Bayou Ridge existed only in fading ink and scattered memory. The land where the school once stood remained privately owned farmland. By the late 20th century, most residents of St. Landry Parish no longer remembered the structure. Roads had shifted, property lines had been redrawn. The bayou's edge had crept slightly eastward with seasonal flooding. Then, in the summer of 1982, a drainage improvement project altered the ground that had not been disturbed in generations. Local contractors were hired to deepen a runoff channel near the former school site after repeated crop damage from standing water. During excavation, a backhoe struck something solid beneath several inches of compacted soil and root growth. It was not stone. It was metal. Workers uncovered a small, rusted container lodged near what historical property maps would later confirm had been the eastern side of the school's interior, close to where the teacher's desk would have stood. The container was rectangular, roughly the size of a thick book, sealed with corroded hinges. Time and moisture had eaten into its surface, but it remained intact enough to protect what was inside. When opened, it contained several folded documents wrapped in deteriorating cloth. Among them were loose attendance sheets dated March 20, 1920. Unlike the bound ledger preserved in parish archives, these sheets appeared separate, possibly preliminary records before final transcription. The handwriting matched the ledger's script. The dates overlapped the final weeks before entries stopped. But the numbers differed slightly. On at least 2 sheets, attendance appears even lower than what the official ledger reflects. One page lists only 4 students present. Another page contains a short notation written in the margin: "Meeting required, matter unresolved." The note is not expanded upon. No names are attached. In addition to the attendance sheets, the container held a folded letter addressed to the St. Landry Parish School Board. The envelope was never stamped or postmarked. It appears it was never mailed. The letter's ink had bled from moisture exposure, but portions remained legible. It referenced circumstances requiring discretion and temporary suspension pending further instruction. The phrase "pending further instruction" stands out, because no further instruction appears in the parish record. The final item in the container was a partially burned document. The upper portion was charred, suggesting deliberate attempt at destruction. The remaining visible text includes the word "complaint" and what appears to be a signature line, though the signature itself is illegible. There is no explicit description of misconduct. No clear allegation survives. But the presence of a complaint draft, combined with an unsent letter and unofficial attendance sheets, complicates the narrative of routine closure. The discovery was reported briefly in a local parish bulletin in August 1982. The article described it as a small collection of early school documents found during excavation. It did not speculate on their significance. The documents were transferred to a regional historical society for preservation. No formal state-level investigation followed. Why? Because there was no confirmed crime, no body, no filed police report from 1920 tied to the school. Without evidence of criminal activity, the find was treated as archival curiosity, not legal matter. Yet historians reviewing the documents decades later noted something subtle but important. The official parish ledger, the one stored in archives, ends cleanly on March 17th. The loose sheets in the metal container include dates extending 3 days beyond that entry. Those dates were never transferred into the bound record, which suggests the official ledger was not updated with the final entries. It may have been intentionally closed before those last days occurred, or it may have been submitted incomplete. Either way, the metal container preserves what the official archive does not. The location of the container raises questions. Why was it buried beneath the floor area near the teacher's desk? If the materials were meant for record-keeping, they would have been sent to the parish board. If they were meant to be discarded, they likely would have been burned entirely. Instead, they were sealed and hidden. Not destroyed, not archived, hidden. There are plausible explanations. The teacher may have intended to protect personal documentation during uncertainty. A dispute may have arisen, prompting hesitation before submitting formal complaint. An internal investigation may have begun, but never concluded. The burial could reflect fear, caution, or simply interrupted process. But it demonstrates one undeniable fact. There was activity at Bayou Ridge after the official ledger stopped. Someone wrote those final pages. Someone drafted that letter. Someone attempted to destroy at least part of a document, then preserved the remainder. In historical research, discoveries rarely answer questions cleanly. More often, they shift the shape of the unknown. Before 1982, Bayou Ridge appeared to fade quietly. After the excavation, it became clear that something unsettled occurred during its final days, something serious enough to draft correspondence to the parish board, serious enough to consider formal complaint, and serious enough that the materials were never officially filed. The school did not simply stop, it paused in tension, and that tension was sealed in metal, placed beneath the floorboards, and left for 62 years before resurfacing. Not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate enough to endure underground. And in historical investigation, buried documents often speak more clearly than public records ever did.
The word cover-up carries weight. It implies intent, concealment, and wrongdoing. Historians are cautious with it, and for good reason. In the case of Bayou Ridge School, there is no documented crime, no court file, no arrest record, no obituary linked to scandal. What exists instead is a pattern of absence paired with a buried set of documents that were never officially submitted. So the question is not whether a crime occurred. The question is whether information was intentionally contained. To understand that possibility, it helps to examine how rural parish governance operated in early 20th century Louisiana. Parish school boards held significant autonomy. Decisions about staffing, discipline, and closures were often made locally. In small communities, formal legal escalation was not always the first step. Matters involving teachers, families, or property disputes were frequently resolved privately, particularly if public exposure threatened economic stability. Reputation mattered. A school associated with scandal could affect land values, parish funding, and political standing. In farming regions dependent on seasonal contracts and credit relationships, stability was currency. If a serious allegation emerged, whether involving misconduct, negligence, or dispute between influential families, the incentive to contain it quietly would have been strong. That does not mean concealment occurred, but it does mean the structure allowed for it. The buried container complicates the narrative. Inside it were unofficial attendance sheets, an unsent letter referencing circumstances requiring discretion, and a partially burned complaint document. Those items suggest interruption. They suggest hesitation. They suggest something was in process and then stopped. If the teacher drafted a complaint but never mailed it, why? If the parish board received a verbal report, why is there no summary note? If closure was temporary, why was there no reopening? One possibility is administrative compression. A conflict may have arisen between families. Attendance may have dropped sharply as a result. Rather than escalating the issue formally, the board may have decided to close the school quietly and disperse remaining students to nearby districts. Such decisions were not unheard of. Another possibility involves health. Although major influenza waves peaked earlier, smaller outbreaks persisted regionally. If illness spread rapidly within a small schoolhouse, parish officials may have chosen immediate suspension without lengthy documentation. But health closures typically generated at least brief notation, especially if funding was affected. The absence across multiple administrative categories suggests a different pattern, not oversight, but minimization. Minimization can take subtle forms.
Rather than issuing a closure report that invites questions, officials simply stop listing the institution. Rather than archiving a complaint that demands inquiry, it is never formally submitted. Rather than documenting a dispute, they resolve it off-record. This is not unique to Bayou Ridge. Across American rural history, there are documented cases where institutional records thin dramatically during moments of controversy. Not erased, not destroyed, just thinned. Silence becomes administrative strategy. Yet there is an equally plausible counterpoint: decay of process rather than deliberate concealment. Rural parishes sometimes struggled with consistent record-keeping. Clerks changed, ledgers were misplaced, informal communication substituted for written confirmation. The buried documents may reflect nothing more than interrupted procedure, a teacher intending to file paperwork before the school closed unexpectedly. But the partially burned complaint introduces tension. Burning implies reconsideration. It implies someone chose not to preserve the full document. The act of sealing the remaining materials in a metal container and placing them beneath the floor complicates that further. It was not casual disposal, it was concealment with preservation. That duality matters. Someone did not want the materials visible, but also did not want them entirely destroyed. Why preserve something privately if it holds no consequence? Perhaps the teacher feared retaliation. Perhaps the matter involved individuals with local influence. Perhaps the letter was never sent because a private agreement was reached. In small communities, disputes sometimes concluded with handshake settlements rather than official proceedings. But handshake settlements leave no archive. And when archives thin in coordinated ways, historians take note. There is an equally plausible counterpoint: power imbalance. Bayou Ridge served working families, renters, laborers, individuals without strong political leverage. If conflict arose between those families and someone connected to parish authority, the imbalance would have shaped outcome. Yet there is no documented accusation to analyze. The silence protects everyone and indicts no one, which may have been the point. If a matter was handled privately, erasing paper prevented escalation. Without paper, there is no appeal. Without record, there is no precedent. And over time, absence becomes normal. By 1922, Bayou Ridge no longer appeared in parish listings. By mid-century, it faded from maps. By the time excavation revealed the metal container in 1982, nearly every direct witness was gone. A cover-up does not always require elaborate deception. Sometimes it requires only restraint, a decision not to record, not to file, not to formalize. Whether Bayou Ridge's ending reflects deliberate concealment or administrative collapse may never be proven, but the pattern is clear. The ledger stopped mid-March. 3 families disappeared from local documentation. A complaint was drafted but never submitted. An unsent letter referenced discretion, and the materials were hidden rather than archived. That is not proof of crime, it is proof of interruption. And interruption, when paired with silence, often signals that the official version of events is incomplete. History does not always announce what was hidden. Sometimes it whispers through what was withheld. And at Bayou Ridge, something was withheld.
History is often imagined as permanent, something fixed in ink, sealed in archives, and protected by institutions. We tend to believe that if an event mattered, it would have been written down, filed, preserved. But the story of Bayou Ridge suggests something more complicated. Institutions do not only record events, they choose how to record them. What is summarized, what is minimized, what is left unwritten, and sometimes what is allowed to fade quietly. The children of Bayou Ridge were real. Their names were carefully entered into a ledger, their attendance was marked day after day, their presence mattered enough to track. And then, without formal closure, that tracking stopped. There was no final exam recorded, no graduation list, no official statement announcing the school's end, just blank pages. The buried documents discovered decades later do not confirm tragedy, they do not confirm crime, they do not accuse anyone. What they confirm is interruption, a moment when something unsettled the normal rhythm of record-keeping. An unsent letter referencing discretion, a complaint partially burned, attendance sheets never transferred to the official ledger. These details suggest hesitation, a pause in process, a decision point that was never formalized. Perhaps what happened at Bayou Ridge was small in the scale of history. Perhaps it was a dispute resolved quietly. Perhaps families chose to leave for reasons unrelated to scandal. Perhaps the teacher departed suddenly, and the parish board decided consolidation was simpler than explanation. All of these possibilities remain open. But the coordinated silence across board minutes, newspaper notices, property records, and employment logs is what lingers. Silence is not absence of activity, it is absence of documentation. And documentation is power. When something is recorded, it becomes part of collective memory. When it is not, it drifts toward obscurity. Over time, the lack of record becomes indistinguishable from lack of event. That is how places disappear. Not in fire, not in catastrophe, but in omission. Bayou Ridge did not burn. It did not collapse into the bayou. It simply ceased to be mentioned. By mid-century, maps forgot it. By late century, residents barely remembered it. And if not for a rusted metal container uncovered in 1982, even its final days might have remained entirely unexamined. The families who vanished from parish documentation may have built new lives elsewhere. The children may have grown into adults whose descendants never knew their names once appeared in a ledger beside a Bayou, Louisiana bayou. But on paper, their story ends in March 1920. And that ending, unfinished, unexplained, reminds us that history is not just what survives, it is also what was allowed to disappear. We often search archives for answers. Sometimes what we find instead are gaps. And gaps demand attention. Some histories aren't lost, they're hidden. If stories like this matter to you, the quiet ones, the unfinished ones, the ones buried in the margins, consider following this channel. Because history isn't only found in monuments and headlines. Sometimes it waits beneath the floorboards. And sometimes all it takes is looking closer to realize something was never meant to be forgotten, only overlooked.